killers of society cruise down the road each day.
In May 2011, the United Kingdom has a referendum on which voting system to use for future general elections. There are two choices. The first, our current system, first past the post.
If you look at the waves of countries that have become democratic in the last 20 years or so, if you look at South Africa, if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, nobody came knocking on Britain's door saying, oh, how do you run this brilliant first past the post system? That's what we want.
Or the alternative vote.
At the moment, 2/3 of MPs don't have the support of a majority of people who went out to vote in their constituency. A lot of MPs are there despite representing only a minority of local electors. AV stops that. It means that at least an MP can speak for some sort of majority of the people in their area. AV also frees people from tactical voting. You don't have to vote tactically under AV. Under the current system, you often have to make a choice between supporting the party whose values you really agree with. Say if you're a Green Party supporter, there was only one constituency where your candidate really stood a chance in the last election. Everywhere else, you had to think of, oh, who's the least worst among the rest of them, and support them if you wanted your vote to affect who got into Parliament.
You may think that it's a really good thing that we've been given a choice of two voting systems to choose from. Yes, it is. We'd only be doing the best for you, wouldn't we? But have you asked yourself why it is that it is just two systems, and that the most representative and the most democratic system isn't even included in the choice?
There are different ways of doing it. I mean, for instance, if you had several MPs working for a constituency, hey, competition's supposed to raise standards in public services. Why not have competition between members of Parliament to see who does the best job of representing the people locally? You can get that under PR systems, you can't get it under AV. You can, I think, as we've seen, have coalition governments, even under first past the post, and I don't think there's any case that the coalition is sort of muddled. It seems to know what it's doing, like its policies or dislike them. It's getting on with what it wants to do. So I think a lot of the things people sort of use as scare tactics against PR, that we have coalitions, that you lose the single member link with constituencies, these aren't really problems at all.
And I find it very odd that it's the politicians who should be telling us which voting systems we should be choosing from. As our servants, we should be telling them which systems we want to choose from. This is far too important to let them decide on the choices. Why would you want to consider even more options on voting systems? The media are already telling you this is a boring subject and far too complicated for you to understand. Do yourselves a favour in these hard economic times and just keep it as simple as possible. What do you think? It's not as if we'd hoodwink you, is it?
I would say that the best way anyone's found of organising a referendum on the electoral system is what they did in British Columbia in Canada. There, they didn't just present people with two options that the governments dictated to them. They actually asked people what choice they wanted to make. How they did this was to gather together a group called the Citizens' Assembly, made up of ordinary members of the public, who then sort of discussed, debated collectively, came to a view on which alternative system was best for the circumstances of British Columbia. The same thing happened again in Ontario as well. And so you have the people not only making a choice between two options at the end, but you've actually got some genuine kind of open and transparent involvement in writing the question, rather than having the government dictating which of two options you have to choose between.
So proportional representation, the most representative and therefore democratic voting system, is not even being given to us as an option in this forthcoming referendum. We were only fiddling our expenses for a year or so. And of course, we certainly never did it before we were exposed. You believe that, don't you? And when the Twin Towers came down, we didn't, as politicians, think that it was really a good day to bury bad news. You believe that, don't you? Yes, I thought so. So we obviously wouldn't be sending you a red herring with AV, would we?
people really don't think in a two-party way in the same sort of sense as they did, say, in the 1950s. People are interested in making lots of different choices. If you have elections in this country, such as the European Parliament elections under PR, you get people voting for a whole variety of parties. Even in general elections, people's choices are getting kind of more and more diverse in how they vote. Back along, the two main parties both got over 40% of the vote. We've just had two elections where neither of the two big parties has got over 40% of the vote. So the way people choose is changing. And what AV does is kind of shores up a kind of two-party model of how politics works. If you are interested in representing the kind of broad spread of what people think and believe, then you need a system based on a different principle. That's proportional representation.
So when you look at it, we'll be choosing between two very similar systems, and the majority of the media will deflect away from the actual lack of choice by debating in detail the alternative vote and first past the post as if they are the real and only choice.
The choice I think the public should have is to design a new system through a double referendum or through a citizens' assembly, and have a choice of a system that's already been a bit road tested by public involvement. If I were just picking in Whitehall and just picking two options, I'd say probably you'd have to put first past the post in there because it's the current system. I'd like to see a choice of what was proposed by the Jenkins Commission in 1998, which is called AV+, which is essentially AV for most seats in the House of Commons, and then a proportional element to make sure parties' seats were a bit more representative of the votes cast. It's a PR system, but it's one where if a party's doing really well, like Labour did in 97, it would have a majority. That would be quite a meaningful choice, I think. The other meaningful choice, I think, would be between the first past the post system and the single transferable vote form of PR, where you have several MPs representing the same constituency. And people vote in the same way as they do under AV, 1, 2, 3, rather than just putting an X. It's a system they have in Ireland. It works pretty well.
Hang on a minute. If you think about it, we've been governed for years and years by a so-called democratic system, but with a completely undemocratic voting system. And now we're being offered another system that's not the best for democracy. How can we be living in a democracy if we don't have a democratic voting system? Come on, us fine people in power wouldn't have pulled the wool over your eyes by telling you over and over again that you were living in a democracy when you really haven't been, would we? We may have told you over and over again there were weapons of mass destruction, but it doesn't mean the same technique would work with democracy, does it?
They're saying you can have one of these two systems. The thing is, these two systems are basically similar kinds of things. We're not getting a real choice between systems based on different principles. We don't have the option at the moment of asking for a system where people's votes are reflected fairly in seats in Parliament. That's off the table.
If a government or a major political party who supports first past the post, incidentally the system that benefits them the most, didn't want to include the system that benefits them the least, which is proportional representation, but wanted to appear to be offering the public a choice, then the best system for them would be the alternative vote, as it's the closest to first past the post, and so therefore very little will change.
AV is not a proportional system. It's probably best to think of it as an improved, modernised version of the current system we have, first past the post. It doesn't produce results that relate the seats in Parliament directly to how people vote. It doesn't give people a great deal more choice in terms of the parties that you see ending up in Parliament. It still means it's possible to get a majority of seats on a fairly small minority of the vote. So it suffers from a lot of the same democratic flaws that the first past the post system does.
So it's not really much choice at all. And we are going to be heading once more for a future without a democratic voting system, whatever the outcome of this referendum.
AV in Australia hasn't stopped their political system boiling down to essentially a two-party choice between two very strong, well-organised parties, who then generally manage to squeeze out smaller parties and stop them getting represented in the House of Representatives at least.
We have once again allowed the people who are supposed to be there to serve us to control our choices, when it really should be us, the British public, who set the agenda.
So AV isn't a brilliant system from the point of view of offering the kind of choice, the pluralism, the diversity that people are used to in most aspects of life now in politics.
Shouldn't we, in the first instance, be having a referendum on which voting systems we actually want to choose from?
I think for real reform, for a real change in the way politics works, we need to be much more radical and go for a proportional type system of the sort that most countries did 90 years ago.
We are becoming just merely spectators in the political process, the only participants being the politicians themselves. Isn't it time for real change? Where's that book published in the Middle East on how to get rid of governments?
Well, I'm walking down the freeway on that dotted line. I'd like to make decisions, but they won't allow the time. It says religion is the opium. I say the media's the cocaine. 24 hours of propaganda, drugging my poor brain. Them pillars of society drive us like a tool. For them, that's cool. They confer titles of status and dominance on their progeny and their class. Sir, your honor, your grace, your highness were made to polish and lick their brass. But you, my friend, can be like them if you have their $1 million fee. But you find the system